Hello, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. Today, we explore Beyond LID, Green Infrastructure. This is one of the Focus on Sustainability webinars. This series was developed by a group of regional organizations known for their quality ecological education. By working together, the webinar series enables us to expand the reach of our individual programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they are all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco Landscape California. If you have a question, you may send it to us in the question window at any time during the broadcast, and the questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now I would like to introduce our presenters, John Ford and Brian Kuchar. Brian is a registered landscape architect, a registered professional engineer, and lead accredited professional. Currently a senior landscape architect at Horsley Witten Group, he has over 18 years of experience in the combined fields of site engineering and landscape architecture, working on stormwater management and green infrastructure among a wide range of projects in both public and private sectors. John Ford is a senior project manager at Horsley Witten Group. His planning and design approach is based on the principles of new urbanism and the belief that compact, walkable neighborhoods design creates vibrant, livable places in balance with nature. John is a Knight Fellow in Community Building at the University of Miami School of Architecture, co-founder and board member of the New England chapter of the Congress of New Urbanism, and a board member for the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome, John and Brian.
Thank you, Penny. This is John. Thank you very much to the ELA for hosting this webinar, and thanks to you folks for taking some time out of your day to join us. So the title of today's webinar, Beyond LID, Green Infrastructure. Where we always like to start is to really get an understanding of why this is important in the first place. Right? Why is LID important, especially as we get outside of preaching to the choir of landscape and civil engineering nerds like myself and Brian? We know that this is increasingly becoming in the public consciousness, the effects of stormwater runoff and watershed health affecting everyday life, quality of life, local economies, with the effects of climate change and increasing severity and intensity of storm events. We're seeing increasing flooding and increasingly serious effects. Increasing beach closures. This is in Rhode Island, the ocean state, where that's key to our livelihood and sense of well-being, is our connection to nature. And stormwater runoff and water quality are having significant effect on our beaches. Sea level rise. We're working in communities across New England and across the country where we're forecasting out within 1 or 2 generations, rising sea level and increasing storm severity are projected to have very serious consequences on many of the historic towns and cities that are located on the coast. And locally, in our neighborhoods, our parks, our streets are seeing the effects of erosion and increasingly incised stream banks and creek channels. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. In my neighborhood, this happens to be adjacent to a community park, and this is not what you want to see as a shining example of open space. So the good news, within the last 5, maybe 10 years, low impact development and green infrastructure are increasingly seen as the way to deal with site planning, stormwater management, landscape design, to better handle stormwater runoff. And we know this because the politicians now are coming to us. Those running for office, those in office, coming to announce platform and policy changes that are tied to green infrastructure bonds, open space bonds tied to stormwater management and watershed health. On the left, gubernatorial candidates touring green infrastructure. This is a cottage community site in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, to get a handle on why this is important. So we know if the politicians are coming to us at this point that there's a connection to a wider audience in the general public. So as we transition to what LID is, as the message is increasingly getting out there to a wider audience, which we know is connected to the opportunity to really make a change on a widespread basis, I think the vocabulary becomes increasingly important. What are we talking about when we're talking about LID and green infrastructure? This is taken directly from the Rhode Island State Stormwater Manual, recently updated in 2010. The definition of LID to reduce impervious cover, prevent impacts to natural drainage systems, utilize simpler, less complex, decentralized stormwater management BMPs, best management practices, to naturally filter and infiltrate stormwater runoff as close to where it falls as we possibly can, and create a multifunctional landscape. So can our landscape serve a stormwater management purpose, but also be adding to community value, also be increasing property values, also serve maybe as traffic calming? Can it be doing multiple functions? So that, I think, is the widely understood definition of what low impact development is. And we see that now codified. So these are the first page of 4 New England State Stormwater Manuals, and LID now is the way to handle stormwater management. But what Brian and I will be talking about today is how do we evolve that definition to be more than a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Here we see a beautiful residential single-family context rain garden. So this is taking stormwater runoff, filtering it, getting in the ground close to where it falls. This is LID from the EPA. We see a demonstration project in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, a rain garden implemented at their town hall. A great first step in terms of visibility to the general public, and absolutely in line with the definition of LID. New Hampshire Stormwater Manual is here with this graphic telling us that each of those red arrows represents disconnection of rooftop or driveway impervious. So instead of that runoff going into a pipe, into the municipal system, instead we're cutting those leaders, discharging them across the lawn, filtering, getting into the ground, not entering the municipal system. So a simpler approach. Here, LID in the term, the form of conservation subdivision, going from 2 cul-de-sacs on the left to 1 in order to conserve open space, conserve natural systems, and create a more compact limit of disturbance on the right. Doesn't only have to be residential. Here from the Connecticut State Stormwater Quality Manual, an LID green approach to a mall parking lot. So we're incorporating grass swales, we're incorporating maybe turf pavers, permeable pavers for overflow parking, and those types of BMPs to green up and dress up a big box parking lot. And here, Savannah, Georgia, we have a LEED certified shopping center, believe it or not. If you look at the top picture, not a lot of green in that picture. And on the bottom, you can park your hybrid in the first of many hundred parking spaces in this big box retail arrangement. The concern to us, especially when we talk about increasing a wider audience for green infrastructure and LID, is how do we fit green infrastructure and LID into the context of some of the most well-loved towns and cities that we experience. So here in New England, this is my neighborhood, Providence, Rhode Island. This is suburban, as it was a neighborhood close to the urban core. This is suburban before it became suburban, right? So a pretty compact residential neighborhood with a main street. Brookline, Massachusetts. See a bit of the emerald necklace here. A very green community, but also a dense, walkable urban place with a different context and a different feel. Northampton, Massachusetts, a very well-loved, mixed-use, walkable place. And East Greenwich, Rhode Island, where we had politicians touring this Cottages on Green. This is a compact 15-cottage community that was recently built adjacent to the main street that utilized green infrastructure BMPs, including bioretention and pervious pavement. So these are well-loved places. These examples from New England, I'm sure you can all identify places like this close to you if you're not in New England, Provincetown. Places where there is a mix of uses, a higher density. These are places that are very high in value, both to the community, and these are places where tourists are coming to visit and choose to be. How do we integrate green infrastructure into these types of places? And God forbid we use the terms Manhattan and watershed health in the same sentence. But if we're going to go beyond the initial definition of LID, or maybe to say we're going to evolve that definition to include a wider perspective, what does that mean? And these are our 5 points. We're not going to talk in great detail about each and every one. We're going to kind of hone in on a few, but we're calling this LID 2.0. And the first point is density. Not all impervious area is equal. In other words, there may be places that vary in scale, our towns and cities, where we have more people, more commercial space, more development intensity and future growth plan to have more people living with less impervious area and less impact on the environment on a per capita basis. Number 2, planning with the land. So this is very much in line with the original definition of LID. We're planning around sensitive natural systems that are doing more, that are working harder, like well-draining soils, or planning around steep slopes. So we're planning our compact, walkable communities with the land and taking our cues from nature. So that leads us into the third point, approximating nature. We're utilizing our toolkit of stormwater BMPs, like rain gardens, green roofs, permeable pavement, to be as close to the existing water balance as we possibly can. So we're getting that stormwater into the ground, naturally filtered with plants, wherever we can, as close to where it falls as possible. So our post-development scenario and our post-development impact is as close to a natural system as we possibly can using engineered tools. Number 4, and possibly most important, designing our green infrastructure to context. So this kind of runs in combination with the first point, where our green infrastructure tools, our landscape design, really must be implemented to fit its place. A town or an urban infrastructure design or landscape design might not necessarily fit in a rural context, and vice versa. And that's where we get beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to LID. And then 5th, leaving a simple solution behind. We know that if our landscape design is simple, it's visible, it's easily understood by those that might not be in the engineering and landscape design profession, we know that there's going to be a higher chance of it being maintained for its original function over a long period of time. And we know that if it's lovable infrastructure, it has a higher chance of being understood and maintained over time. So for today's presentation, we're really honing in on the landscape end of things. So we're going to be talking in more detail, and I'll hand it off to Brian in a minute, really about approximating nature and designing landscape to context, the 3rd and the 4th points. And then how do our tools and how do our designs, how are they simple? How are they easily understood? How are they lovable? Before we move on to Brian, we do want to go through in a little bit more detail to flesh out why density is important, because I think that really illuminates the importance of context. We know not all impervious area is equal. Across the country, we've been building in a manner where we're sprawling our road systems out. We're increasingly building complexes of single land uses. Here we see that very clearly with single residential types built in pods with longer road systems to serve them. And with each of those residential communities comes the required big box retail or commercial site. And we see this all over the country. And not a lot of green here. We have a whole lot of impervious area that's not going to serve a great purpose, except perhaps during the parking apocalypse on Black Friday or something like that. And we know you can look at this parking lot that you could pretty much land a plane in this parking lot without having to move a single car or a single tree. And I checked it. You could land a small craft in this parking lot. So that's, to me, the definition of inefficient infrastructure. So this is something that's been studied, something that we looked at for the EPA to get an understanding of a business case for smarter growth. How can we build, say, the top scenario here, and for the same exact development build out, the top is more of a town center scenario, where the development, if you can see my cursor here, the development is compact. It looks like some of those New England towns and villages pictures that we looked at a few minutes ago, arranged around a center, a walkable edge, 5 minutes from center to edge. Whereas below, and this is an actual site, by the way, in South Carolina, it's built out according to the zoning code on the books with single-use pods, separated land uses, same exact build out in terms of commercial space and residential units. And what the EPA wanted to know is what's the impact for builders? What's a business case to say, even to hit a market that wants a town center type product, what does it cost? Does it cost more to build that? And what we found is that there's a huge number of variables in terms of the can of worms of variables here, from street design to parking assumptions and that type of thing. But it's measurable. And so how does that translate to today's talking about infrastructure and low impact development? Well, we know that there's a direct connection between the impervious area that is required for infrastructure costs to build streets, to build parking lots, to build sidewalks, and the corresponding utilities and infrastructure for sprawling land use patterns in comparison to a town center land use pattern. And the connection between that cost with the impervious area, direct connection to stormwater runoff. If we can be more compact with our build out and our impact on our natural systems, we can reduce stormwater runoff volume and increase water quality. So each of these three, for each graph, there's a TND or a traditional neighborhood development on the left, and an apples to apples, same development, build out, conventional suburban on the right. And you can see the TND or the town pattern outperforming the conventional. So as density goes up, the runoff volume, now this is per capita, per residential unit, the runoff volume going down. So that really leads us into thinking about organizing our places instead of by use, but by development intensity. And there's a variety of ways to look at that, but really from urban core, urban center, general urban, suburban, and then rural and natural, as we used to organize communities, really a convenient way to think about how we can tie our low impact development and our green infrastructure tools to a type of place. And that's where I'll hand it off to Brian to talk about some projects that really bring to light the importance of context and simple solutions.
Thank you, John. I think John does a great job sort of outlining or presenting the case for high density development and increasing the compactness of whether it's redevelopment or proposed new development. But the challenge is either way, there's still impervious cover that would need to be treated, and there's still stormwater management that needs to be done. And I think some of John's earlier slides with LID applications show some of the challenges based on space and area that is typically thought of or traditionally used or required to implement LID practices. So where we've sort of evolved over time is how do we integrate these same principles into a much more urban landscape where space is limited, and then there's additional aesthetic, environmental, and regulatory challenges as well. So I'm going to sort of just cover what we've learned and sort of where we're going and discuss some of the applications for infill and redevelopment. The slide you see here, I think it demonstrates a bunch of different applications that could be used in a more urban environment, whether it's green infrastructure as part of your streetscape improvements, or landscaping screening along the edge of a parking lot. Maybe there's proprietary product applications such as tree filter pits that could be used, or we rethink how we use our public spaces, or maybe how our landscape actually functions within the context of stormwater. So I'm going to briefly sort of go over some of the things we've learned as a firm, and in particular myself. So this is sort of my portion of the presentation where I point out my own flaws, or I wouldn't call them mistakes, but things I've learned over time that maybe don't work so well, especially when we start talking about green infrastructure in the more urban context. The earlier designs of bioswales, typically we were looking at a 6 to 12 inch depth. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with some of these practices, and you probably adapted as well. Flat bottom, zero slope to promote infiltration. Often this presented grading challenges. The practices become too steep. And we've seen a lot of issues with side slope stabilization and a traditional curb and gutter systems. What we've learned is that shallower has its advantages. Maybe it presents a little bit of a challenge on the treatment front, but from an aesthetic and from a functionality standpoint, the shallow depth certainly has its advantages. Also provides ease of maintenance. So what we've tried to do is use more check dams. So we're not trying to keep long linear practices flat over long lengths. We're looking to provide check dams to allow some cascading, and that requires an increase in the biocells. Some of the benefits are it's an improved aesthetic because of that shallower depth. The function is significantly improved, and obviously maintenance, which is really the next big issue I see in green infrastructure, is an improvement as well. Curbs, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, that we've looked at the challenges of creating curb and gutter. Our earlier designs, we would use inlet flumes, similar to what you see on the slide at the top, on the top right. Some of the lessons, and it increases side slope and depth, obviously, because I'm adding 6 inches of grade on the bioswale side that I would then have to make up. Some of the lessons we've learned is that's good when we can apply to a zero curb is a better approach. If we can remove the curb and provide more sheet flow into the practice, obviously this eliminates cost and then can provide an easier maintained application, and allowing for sheet flow certainly has its advantages as well. Some of the benefits, again, we believe, if you look at the image on the bottom right, is an improved aesthetic that has just a cobble edge and allows sheet flow into the practice. Again, it promotes that shallower depth and always sort of the theme, easier maintenance. Sediment forebays is an interesting one. This has sort of evolved over time. In my practice, I think I put the slide at the upper right-hand corner here to demonstrate. This is an installation that was installed, and there was construction going on after the installation. So things hadn't had a chance to stabilize. We spent a lot of time and energy to keep sediment out of the forebay because a lot of the site hadn't been stabilized, and it occurred to me, sort of an aha moment, that maybe we should be rethinking about how we're treating or capturing the sediment. The two slides at the bottom show more traditional inlet flumes, and you can see the one on the lower left has significant sand and sediment accumulation before it even gets into what was designed to be a more traditional sediment forebay. The one on the right shows leaf litter and accumulation over time that then allows you to capture the sediment in the inlet flume, rather bringing it into the more vegetated forebay. This, of course, would require more frequent cleaning, but and would not meet the sediment storage volume requirements, but it might be considered a better application if you can convince the client or the municipality to provide more frequent cleaning, but certainly a lot less labor required and a lot less physical input. So this is just an example of some of the sediment forebays. I always tend to, I try to look for precedents or people who are looking at the same issues, who have struggled with some of the same problems we deal with. And these are just sort of a bunch of different applications of inlet flumes and ways that you can possibly capture the sediment before it gets into your more vegetated practice. They all have their pluses and minuses, I believe, but again, I think it's thinking sort of beyond the traditional approach and trying to ease the maintenance burden for both municipalities and the agencies or private developers required to maintain these. A little discussion here on plants. Earlier designs, I think we always, or I know our firm looked to provide an aesthetic and an ornamental value. The two images on the top show a particular practice at an affordable housing development where ornamental value was of a premium. It was on the edge of the property. After the planting, we did get a lot of feedback and comments back from the residents saying that they thought that the bioretention of the rain garden area was probably the highlight of the landscape, and we thought that was interesting, and we thought that was great feedback. But then if you look 5-6 years later, the images I show on the bottom are what it looks like today. Obviously, it was not maintained. Weeds and other plant material overtook what was planted. So although it still functions very well as a stormwater practice, it doesn't meet the design goals and what we envision this particular site to look like after a certain amount of time. So it gives us pause to maybe rethink how we're planting these, and maybe they don't have to have such a high ornamental value, in particular at this site that was located on the edge of the property, and just as you can see in the photos below, just does not receive the maintenance that would be required. So early designs was predominantly native plants is the way we looked at it. We would typically include larger shrubs. Trees were often excluded, and we looked for ornamental and flowering value. Again, lessons learned is a greater mix of plants serves us well. We're looking for things that can compete or outcompete the weeds. Grasses, herbs, and forbs do a very good job of this, where what we found is shrubs and some of the other native plantings allow for weed growth, and the maintenance requirements are far greater. So we look for a less manicured and ornamental, more wild and natural look, and so we're applying this to the green infrastructure in the more urban environments where we're trying to bring a little more unkept and wild look into a urban environment. Obviously, the benefits are lower maintenance on the weeding front, and if the weeds do sort to intrude, if done correctly, maybe they're not as noticeable, and I'll show you some examples of that. And also a better chance for long-term success. And again, going back to that earlier slide, that really didn't meet the requirement. This is another affordable housing project here on the Cape. This practice was integrated into the site. The plant selection was different material. A lot more grasses were used. And I just wanted to sort of show what this looks like today compared to what we saw in the earlier slide for the more ornamental practice. This is predominantly switchgrass. There is some black-eyed Susans in there and coneflowers, but the switchgrass is really sort of taken over. We don't worry too much about that because from a maintenance standpoint, it's done a great job of suppressing the weeds, and we think overall it's fairly well maintained, and we also attribute that to being better integrated into the surrounding landscape, where people have taken ownership of it and they see this as part of their space versus something that's treating stormwater on the perimeter. This is another example in Providence. It's the box office. This was a redevelopment project. Again, bioswale right along the edge of the streetscape. As you can see, predominantly grass species. Again, doing fairly well and relatively low maintenance. We also look to work with nature. There's applications that nature can do some of the work for us. The two images at the top of this slide show a project in Roger Williams Park, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. This is a wet swale application. Typically in the past, high groundwater tables presented challenges. In this application, we're able to use that natural environment to our advantage and create a wet swale, or it's really a small little pocket wetland or ecosystem in and of itself that treats the stormwater. The image at the bottom left is just a vegetated sand filter. This is landscaped area that was just being mowed and not being used for stormwater treatment at all. We introduced stormwater to it and created the sand filter. And the one on the lower right shows a detention basin retrofit in Peabody, Mass. And this was done to help with flooding issues in the city. But again, the idea that we also made it a landscape feature, and it's in fact part of a disc golf course as well. So again, it's thinking a little bit outside the box that these spaces become more than just stormwater features. Here's a project in Chepachet, Rhode Island, a constructed wetland. Again, this idea of using nature to your benefit. Brownfield site, choked with invasives. We introduced this wet practice to treat stormwater within a historic village. This is more of an end-of-the-pipe treatment system, but again, the idea of looking at different applications for different sites. This is what the site looks like as of fall of last year. So again, the invasives have been controlled and the plants seem to be thriving. Evolution in context, so that's sort of our lessons learned in some of the projects that we've done in the past, and these are some of the things we've seen or the direction we see these practices going. The Steel Yard in Providence, Rhode Island, great site that uses a lot of low maintenance native plants and mostly grass type species that create sort of a natural, very naturalistic environment in an urban setting. This is a streetscape project on the right, Fawcett Street in Cambridge, Mass. You have some iris in there and little blue stem, and in fact, if you look at that photo, believe it or not, there is weed intrusion in there, but for the most part, they blend in nicely with the plants that we used. So if they don't get around to maintaining it, it's not a huge problem. The one on the bottom here is the Mace Public Housing. Again, the same idea. This has goldenrod, Amsonia, and some cone flowers. Also some weeds in here, but again, overall, they fit in nicely to the design if they do not get maintained. This is just a blow up of that same image. Again, we feel it's fairly successful. A lot of the understory that you see is weed growth, but it's working nicely, and it creates a much more naturalistic environment when it's contrast to the hardscape and the landscape you see in the background. These are two slides, not our projects. I'm always looking at precedents. I think this is an innovative way to capture stormwater and reuse of materials. Again, the idea of integrating it into the landscape, and in this application, I would say even celebrating the water, creating spaces and elements or features that people are proud of and then take ownership of. We've also introduced bioswales into the urban environment. I like this particular slide. This shows a flow in, flow out, no structure, no piping. Get the water into the practice, provide treatment and infiltration. For the larger rain events, it flows right out, and if you see on the far left, it flows into the catch basin that's already there. So it's an easy retrofit, and again, sort of simplifying the process, creating simpler solutions for the more urban environment. This is just some of those actual bioswales installed in New York City. Again, just simple curb cuts and plant material and providing additional trees and greenery into the urban landscape. I mentioned earlier that there's proprietary practices as well. I think some of those have evolved and come a long way. In particular, tree filter pits. Although not always my first option, it certainly fits certain applications when space and area is very limited. The big advantage to some of the newer products are the open bottom tree pit, where it helps promote tree growth or root growth, and also the sidewalls of the tree pit or the structure opened as well. So it's only enclosed on one side, which would be the curb side. Again, this idea of promoting infiltration and treatment, but also getting as much or promoting as much root growth or healthy root growth as possible. This is a project in Peabody. This particular site was a brownfield that also flooded heavily. If any of you are familiar with Peabody, Massachusetts, it's usually in the news every winter. They usually have flooding problems in spring. You can see at the bottom, these are the same photos taken after a flooding event. So this particular site is inundated with flood water. We were challenged with developing a park in this location, and we were not allowed, or we could not fill the site or fill our way out of these flooding problems. And in fact, we had to maintain the existing flood storage capacity and provide additional. So you can see in the bottom left, that's what the slide looked like prior to development. This image on the top shows during construction. The project is now complete. It has been flooded. This is shows what the site looks like after a rain event. The image you see here now that sort of pops up is what it looks like after. And these, in fact, were taken in the same sequence. One was taken during the flood event, and one was not too far after. So again, resiliency, creating a space that's adaptable and that can withstand flooding, and then using these public spaces as ways to manage your stormwater. Just one more image of the same site. Again, this is an area that we are trying to promote wetland growth, so you can see it being flooded. Again, after water drains out in the site, withstands the water fairly well. Obviously, there's some level of cleanup, but based on our conversations with the city, it's been relatively successful. And then I just put these in. This is from a festival at that same site this past summer. So again, not only is it managing the stormwater, but we've created a space that the city has indicated is very well used by the community and well loved. So we feel that that ensures the long-term success of this working as a stormwater practice. This is a project in Marston's Mills, streetscape improvements, working in a very dense, historic village environment. You can see at the image below, there's not much space for green infrastructure, so the challenge is how do you make it work if you want to manage the stormwater and provide additional treatment. So what we proposed is creating tree filter or bioswales with tree plantings along the street edge. There's also some traffic calming devices being proposed, such as on-street parking and crosswalks. If you look across the street or on the far left of the image below, you'll see a tree filter pit or tree filter box as well. So again, we're using more than just one application and trying to use what is at our disposal to retrofit a site to provide both aesthetic value and streetscape improvements, but also provide stormwater improvement. And in fact, in this project, the receiving water body, which is part of the village, the mill pond, is an impaired water body, so we're providing improvements as well for the pond. This is a project on Cape Cod, Mashpee Commons. Some of you may be familiar with this. You may have visited, or you may have been shopping here. It's a mixed-use development that began in the late 80s, early 90s, the original phase. We're currently working with the developers on what I would call phase 2. I can show you what it looks like today. The first phase, as you can see, there's a lot of green space or landscape elements and some nice hardscape and nice features that were integrated into the overall design. I would point out that there's some unhealthy tree pits and certainly missed opportunities for stormwater management. So we're working with the developer to try to incorporate some of these more innovative approaches, or sort of these LID or green infrastructure practices that have evolved, such as the bioswale, or using our parking lot islands to treat stormwater, or even using the streetscape. I think the challenge to this particular project is based on the scale and limited space, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. You cannot use one practice. So we had to take what I would consider to be a somewhat innovative approach and use bioswales, tree filter pits, bioretention areas within islands, and then more importantly, convincing the developer that maybe some of these public spaces or green spaces, which are in the olive-colored green, which are over on the upper left corner, and like there's one down here in the lower right. These spaces, using them for stormwater management, both for infiltration and treatment, but then preserve them as green space. The one wild card was this large area that I just highlighted in yellow. That was to be the traditional village green. We made a hard push on this project to use that village green as stormwater treatment and infiltration. I thought it could have handled quite a bit of the runoff that we were creating based upon the development. And we have very good, very well-drained sandy soils on site. And what we were proposing is just putting curb cuts in and allowing the water to flow in to the space for treatment and infiltration, similar to what you see below, and that's a project in Roger Williams Park, where we provided a curb cut and just let the water get into a space that was not being used. Unfortunately, we could not convince the client that that was the best approach for this particular site, so we don't win all the battles. But again, the idea is still looking for opportunities within our public spaces and parklands to provide stormwater treatment. And I'll wrap up with just 2 projects that we're currently working on. They're in the very early stages. We're working with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission on retrofitting 5 schools within the Boston public school system. The project has a strong green infrastructure component and also curriculum and educational. We are looking to integrate the stormwater practices into the school's curriculum so it can be part of the science program, so they can discuss and teach the children about the importance of stormwater management, but also the values of green infrastructure. Actually all 5 of the schools are in the Charles River watershed as well, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is an impaired water body. This is just a 10% concept plan. We're still on the conceptual design phase, but on this particular project, we're looking at retrofitting the front parking lot. You can see the numbers 1 and 2. They indicate a bioswale on one side and a traditional swale on the lower side, and this would be used to demonstrate the different ways waters interact in our environment and how one practice can provide treatment and infiltration, where the other practice is putting the stormwater directly into a pipe system. And then we're also retrofitting the inner courtyard that is 100% impervious cover at this point in time, and we'll be providing some tree filter pits and some stormwater treatment and green space, as well as some additional bioretention in the up in the lower right-hand corner here. And what you see on the side is just some precedent images we use to demonstrate to the school system and our client what these practices may look like. And then the last project here is another school within the Boston public school system. It will focus predominantly on the playground area in the rear. We don't really have as much parking at this site. Our area of focus is right in here, this small courtyard. And what we're proposing is removing the impervious cover that is currently there. It's from our discussions, it's underutilized play space, and we're using that area to provide an educational component and stormwater treatment. And in this particular instance, this site or this practice that is shown would be a very interactive type practice, where we're thinking of using some hand pumps, gauges to measure stormwater flow and volume, and then also provide additional play space for the children. So again, I think this one is a great example of the multifunctionality of green infrastructure and how it can be used to solve not only our stormwater problems, but to provide retrofits and improvements for, in this application, for a school playground that is probably probably underfunded and doesn't have the capacity to take on a complete schoolyard retrofit, but using funds available for stormwater management to also incorporate that into playground or landscape improvements. That wraps up, I think, our presentation. At this time, I'll turn it back to John.
Yeah, so this is John again. In terms of wrapping up, I know that was a whirlwind of project examples and lessons learned, but bringing us back to our original 5 points. And as you heard those projects, the importance to us as we talk about our 5-point LID 2.0 platform, if you will, how our projects increasingly are being tied to denser, more compact places and healing some of the existing towns and cities that have already existed for centuries. How we're planning with the land with our projects and approximating nature at various scales from the neighborhood scale, watershed scale, down to the block, street, and building. How our projects are fitting, how our design must fit within the context, and how our solutions can be as simple as they possibly can, both to fit within the context, but also to be visible and easily understood for their intended purpose or purposes. Because we do think that green infrastructure is lovable infrastructure when it's done right. And that means it'll be maintained over time. And I think the last point for this audience especially is that we're increasingly seeing the economic opportunity of green infrastructure maintenance over time. I think a recurring theme in our designs is an understanding of how they will be maintained over time. And we're increasingly seeing job growth, infrastructure bonds, and green jobs funding programs going to landscape professionals that understand green infrastructure. They know how to take care of green infrastructure and what its the purpose is, and will be growing those jobs over time as the implementation of green infrastructure grows over time. So with that, thank you for joining us. I think we're turning it over to Penny. We look forward to taking some questions, and Brian and I certainly are always available if you want to reach out to us offline.
Thank you, Brian. And John, we do have some questions that have come in. What have you found to be the biggest barriers to implementing LID?
The biggest barriers, I think, traditionally for us really were an understanding of what LID and green infrastructure is intended to do. And I think that barrier over time, and in really relatively a short period of time, is starting to be tackled. So even as recently as 5-10 years ago, a lot of our green infrastructure designs required redundancy. So we would design a green infrastructure system that was intended to be simple, but for various reasons, whether it be local regulations, whether it be whoever was going to be maintaining that system over time, not necessarily accepting that it was going to work as intended or understanding how it would work, to also require a double engineered system for redundancy. And I think as we're starting to see how the green infrastructure is simpler, cheaper, and almost always a more efficient water quality filtering and stormwater solution, that it can stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah, I would agree with what John said. I would also add that just the understanding of the practices and how they're used or how they function. I think the example I showed at Mashpee Commons, where we really wanted to use that park space, but the developer and the client, they just weren't there yet because they really didn't understand how that would function and how that could be used as space. I think they envisioned it as a detention or infiltration basin and not really as a subtle landscape element that then could receive and absorb stormwater. So I don't think we're quite there on the understanding of all the applications, but we've certainly made a lot of progress, and we do see more interest in their use, and in fact we see people asking about using them in projects, or how or can we integrate them into our project.
So many of the points that you've both just made deal on the municipal level. Can you give us some tips for how you suggest promoting this at the homeowner level, how we can convince them that this solution has application at the residential level?
Absolutely. I think many of the projects we've been working on recently are with local green infrastructure coalitions or nonprofit partnerships, or even with municipalities that really understand that the end of pipe large infrastructure detention basin solution is not a viable long-term method for increasing water quality, and that really what we're talking about, decentralized, simpler approaches, require getting to that more fine-grained disconnecting of downspouts, rain barrel, tearing your driveway out and replacing it with paver level. So a lot of the work we've been doing especially with nonprofit advocacy organizations, have to do with outreach. They have to do with local neighborhood watershed studies to identify specific impairments and green infrastructure opportunities. And a lot of what we also work on are then identifying what are demonstration projects that in the right place we can go build a rain garden together and do some outreach in the neighborhood beforehand so that everyone comes out and says, oh, I get it now. I would like to do that at my house and hopefully spur more widespread adoption of these smaller scale decentralized approaches.
Yeah, I would also add that the Roger Williams Park project we worked on, which was really the focus of the project, was improving the water quality of the ponds. What we know based on our studies, and we just know this by, I would probably say common sense, that is that we can't design our way out of the problem. Green infrastructure is not the final solution. It's part of the solution, but really changing people's habits, which I think is what the question was getting to, is how you're going to really start to affect change. So in that particular project, similar to what John was just describing, we did have public outreach. We had a design install for one of the practices and invited the public as well as the Parks Department itself to see both how these practices are designed, but then we also have them actively sort of boots on the ground doing the installation to sort of get the word out. And then obviously signage is a way to promote these practices as well, and at least explain to make them a little more understandable, because really in a watershed such as Roger Williams Park and the ponds, people disconnecting their impervious cover and disconnecting their runoff from their own private property will have a bigger impact than the practices themselves. And then just the Boston Water and Sewer Project, we feel that making these practices visible so as students are learning about green infrastructure, but also we have to consider that parents will be dropping their students off. And again, it's a way to sort of get the word out and encourage or to let people know there are things they can do within their own property, whether it's rain gardens or cisterns, recapturing and reuse, or just intercepting runoff from their property before it gets onto the road into the closed pipe system.
Just tacking onto that, we get really excited about working on school retrofit projects because of the potential to get into science classrooms and talk about why we're doing what we're doing outside in the playground or outside and retrofitting the parking lot. And in building partnerships with the local faculty and staff, that over time, monitoring that first green infrastructure installation becomes a real school-wide effort. The parents get involved, the faculty get involved, and they start building upon that further into the watershed. So as an example, one of the projects that we did recently with a local school in Providence, a few years later, the science classroom was still really working on what the green infrastructure means, and they went out into the watershed, into the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and said, do you know where your stormwater runoff in the street goes? And most didn't know where it went. It went to the Seekonk River. And then the next week, they partnered with the Sewer Commission to put stickers and decals onto the catch basins in the neighborhood that said drains to Seekonk River. And when you hear it from your kids, it's hard to ignore.
Right. And just the one thing probably I should have mentioned is funding is always a question that comes up about how do you fund these projects or design installations or demonstration projects. And the EPA is a great source, I'm sure many of you know, but to always keep your eyes open, especially for community grants that could be available for these types of projects, because all of our design installs are typically funded through EPA grants. So again, it's a good way to fund a project in your community, get a practice installed, but more importantly, get the word out and get the community actively involved in being part of the solution.
We have a follow-up question to that very point. Can you give us a little bit more information about funding opportunities?
Sure. Again, I think the EPA is sort of the first approach. I think always looking for impaired water bodies and knowing the impaired water bodies in your community. Those are the projects that are most likely to get funded. I do think there are a lot of different avenues. As I mentioned, there's the community grant program. There's the Healthy Communities is another opportunity. There are local funding sources. We work with a few private foundations that also will fund projects. Again, it has to fit within the framework of what their goals are as well.
And we try to be creative about the multifunctionality of our green infrastructure. That often we can get, for example, infrastructure funding to, say, rebuild sidewalks and curbs can be utilized to put that curb in a place and rebuild in such a place where the grass strip on a street can also be used to treat and filter stormwater. Or are there places where an intersection could use redesign for safety purposes? And that if we're going to do that, wrapping in green infrastructure funding can address both safety improvements, but also green infrastructure, water quality improvements, and livability and local economic value with beautification. We've worked on a couple of projects where we're using green infrastructure to both build a new park, add bicycle infrastructure, and walkability improvements, but that's also addressing traffic calming. So we're using environmental and DOT funding for those types of projects.
Right, that's a great point. I should have mentioned this when I showed the slide of the project in Peabody. That project was not funded with green infrastructure money. It was a park grant, and then it was also part of brownfield money that was used from a closed landfill. So again, it's being a little bit creative and seeing opportunities where they may not be readily apparent when you first look at the site. And then we also did one of the EPA grants that we worked on. We were able to do an install. It was actually on residential property that was in a impaired watershed. So that was an application where EPA money could be used for residential rain garden installation.
This next question deals with back to, you mentioned the students getting involved and trying to spread the word. How do you suggest residents, adult residents, near proposed projects such as medical office buildings, how do you suggest that the community get involved to introduce these concepts to developers and municipal planning boards?
That's a great question. I think what we have seen as the most effective ways of doing that is really to build a group of like-minded citizens, business owners, stakeholders, because that outreach and building a local coalition of sorts can be very powerful. So we've worked on projects of that sort where maybe you get a group of 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 local interested parties together, and once you have that critical mass, then you do definitely start attracting the attention of the local planning board, the local town planner, and getting some credibility towards going for asks to sites that maybe could use a little bit of help, could use a little bit of green infrastructure, so that collaboratively and together you can be looking for solutions and be looking for funding sources. So we're seeing more of these kind of local coalitions pop up. Some of them are oriented around local parks that maybe could use that angle towards green infrastructure. Some of them are neighborhood groups that maybe have a little green subcommittee of sorts. Maybe they're Main Street organizations that already exist that could serve that purpose.
The one I would also add, watershed organizations and groups. Watershed groups tend to be fairly well organized and can be a fairly powerful advocate for these types of projects, in particular if it's an impaired water body. I'll just use the Charles River watershed as an example, where they're actively involved in a lot of the retrofit projects we do, and often they're a partner, and in fact they're one of our team members on the Boston Water and Sewer project. So they're actively engaged in this process, and they're really a voice for these types of projects. So that's where I would always start. I would look for what's the water body, the receiving water body, is it impaired, and is there a watershed group?
Excellent. We have time for just one more question. And if your questions were not addressed during the session, feel free to contact Jonathan and Brian at the email addresses you see on the screen now. Our last question reflects back on an early comment that you made, John. You mentioned that not all permeable surfaces are of equal value, and this audience member would like you to expound on that a bit.
Sure. So what we're talking about there is one of the fundamental tenets of low-impact development is to reduce impervious area. But when you look at it at a watershed or a neighborhood scale, I think compact places that have a very high impervious percentage, if you looked at them by themselves, on a neighborhood or regional scale, are actually quite efficient when it comes to the impact on the watershed, because we have more people living with less impervious area. So in a way, those walkable compact places are pulling more than their weight by reducing the relative impact from a stormwater runoff perspective. In other words, and then you can compare and contrast with some of the pictures that we showed earlier of some sprawl developments with huge parking lots that are not highly utilized. So that impervious areas is there's a lot of extraneous impervious area that's still generating stormwater runoff, it's still getting sanded and salted, and is having an impact on the receiving water body. So we like to think kind of at the bigger picture perspective to see what impervious area is being used efficiently and what impervious area is not being used efficiently, and then to think about how we're guiding our design and maybe more importantly our zoning and subdivision regulations to not require excessive amounts of green in what is an urban place that might water down the density, but also make sure that we're preserving natural open space where it exists. And hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, John and Brian, for all of these great insights into LID 2.0. There have been so many compelling points that you've made and have certainly given our audience a great deal to consider as they move forward with their projects. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.